There's a measurement that changes everything about how you read a beehive. 1/4 of an inch. That's the number. And for more than a century, most American beekeepers scraped right past it without ever knowing what it meant. The bees knew. They've always known. When a colony starts packing a gap, a crack, a rough edge with that dark, sticky resin, they aren't making a mess. They're screaming. This is a survival response, and it's one of the most misunderstood behaviors in all of traditional beekeeping. If you've ever pried open a hive lid and thought, "These bees have gone crazy with the propolis," that feeling is worth examining. There's one specific gap measurement, just a single fraction of an inch, that determines whether a colony can defend itself or simply cannot. That number, and everything it means biologically, comes later in this episode. If you believe the old ways still hold lessons worth understanding, consider subscribing to this channel. And if you've ever scraped a hive clean and later wondered whether you did the right thing, leave that thought in the comments. You're not alone in asking it. Long before modern Langstroth equipment standardized American beekeeping, hollow tree sections, the old log gums that Appalachian families kept along fence rows and barn sides, were lined naturally with propolis. The bees built it up over years, season by season, until the interior walls were coated in a dark, resinous shell that smelled faintly of pine pitch and dried leaves. Nobody told them to do it. Nobody approved of it or disapproved of it. It simply happened, because that's what bees do when they're left alone inside a cavity that suits them. The bees weren't decorating. They were building an immune system for the space they lived in. What most beekeepers of the late 1800s didn't understand, and what many well-meaning beekeepers still misunderstand today, is this. Propolis is not incidental to the hive. It is structural. It is biological. And every time a beekeeper scrapes it away, the colony reads that absence the way a body reads an open wound. Here's what most people assume. They assume the bees are being difficult. They assume the propolis is a byproduct of overcrowding, or excess resin collection, or simply bees doing what bees do without much reason. More propolis, more frustration. That assumption has cost countless colonies across American history. And it costs colonies today. By 1882, beekeepers in the Ohio River Valley were already arguing in the agricultural papers about whether propolis was useful or merely troublesome. Most voices in those debates came down firmly on the troublesome side. It slowed inspections. It cemented frames together. It stained gloves and stuck to bare skin with a grip that didn't let go easily. The warm, slightly medicinal smell of it, something between pine sap and old beeswax, clung to your hands for days. It was inconvenient, so it got scraped. Season after season, in apiaries across the eastern United States, propolis was treated as something to be removed, and the bees were left to start over every single time. What the bees were actually doing is more remarkable than most people realize, even now. Propolis isn't simply tree resin. When a forager bee lands on a wounded pine or a poplar bud weeping sap, she doesn't just collect the material and carry it home unchanged. She works it. She blends it with wax flakes and salivary secretions during the flight back. By the time it reaches the hive, it has been partially transformed, chemically altered into a compound that carries antifungal, antibacterial, and antiviral properties that the raw resin alone doesn't fully possess. The bees are manufacturing a medicine and a mortar at the same time. That transformation happens in the body of the bee herself, and it means that no two propolis deposits in a hive are quite identical, because no two foragers carry exactly the same blend. Consider what happens now at the hive entrance level. A crack appears. Maybe a board shrinks in late summer heat. Maybe a hive tool leaves a gap along the top box that wasn't there before the last inspection. The bees find it within hours. Scout bees, older workers whose role has already shifted toward building and repair, move along the interior walls, antennae reading every surface, feeling for irregularities the same way a carpenter runs a thumb along a joint. When they find the gap, they stop. They assess. And then the propolis work begins. But here's what changes the entire picture. Not every gap gets sealed. That's the detail that most people miss entirely. A gap smaller than a quarter inch will be packed with propolis, methodically, deliberately, layer by layer, until the opening is closed. A gap larger than a quarter inch tells a different story. Bees will attempt to address it. They may begin propolis work at the edges, but a gap that wide exceeds what the colony can practically seal with resin alone. They may attempt comb construction across it, or simply leave it partially open. And a gap they cannot seal is a gap through which microbial pressure can enter, through which predators can probe, through which the thermal envelope of the brood nest begins to destabilize. The colony doesn't stop caring, they simply run out of capacity. 1/4 of an inch is the threshold between a problem bees can solve and a problem bees cannot. If you value beekeeping knowledge that goes this deep into biology and history, this is the channel that covers it without shortcuts. Subscribing takes one click and keeps this kind of content coming directly to you. Now consider the inside of an Appalachian log gum, the kind kept by families in the hill country of eastern Tennessee or western North Carolina through the early 1900s. Those interior walls, left undisturbed for years, developed a propolis envelope, sometimes 1/8 of an inch thick. The surface was smooth and dark, warm to the touch even in early spring mornings, and it held a faint smell that wasn't quite beeswax and wasn't quite pine, something older and more complex than either. That envelope wasn't aesthetic. It was functional in ways that modern science has only recently begun to document. The surface reduced bacterial colonization. It slowed fungal growth. It changed the acoustic properties of the interior cavity, muffling external vibrations while allowing the colony's own communication frequencies to travel clearly through the comb. That last point is worth slowing down on. Bees communicate partly through vibration. Worker bees transmit signals through the comb itself, signals that regulate foraging, coordinate swarm decisions, and alert the colony to threats. A propolis-lined interior acts as a tuned acoustic environment. It dampens outside noise and mechanical vibration while preserving the frequencies the colony uses internally. When that lining is scraped away, the acoustic environment of the hive changes. That change isn't catastrophic on its own, but it adds to the list of stresses the colony is now managing simultaneously. And here's a layer that most beekeepers never think to consider at all. Every inspection resets the propolis clock. The moment a hive tool breaks the propolis seals between boxes and frames, the colony identifies every disrupted joint as a new vulnerability. They begin rebuilding immediately, but rebuilding takes time and it takes bees. Propolis work pulls workers away from foraging. During a strong nectar flow, that diversion has a real cost. And in the 10 days immediately following a deep inspection, when propolis seals have been disturbed, frames repositioned, and interior surfaces exposed, the colony is operating at its highest level of structural vulnerability. That 10-day window is when secondary stressors hit hardest. That is when a seemingly healthy colony can begin a decline that looks, from the outside, like something else entirely. In the summers of the early 1930s, through the deepest years of the Depression, beekeepers in the Ozark Hill country of Arkansas and Missouri kept their colonies with minimal intervention. Not by philosophy, by necessity. Hive tools were shared between neighbors. Inspections happened twice a season, sometimes less. What those beekeepers observed, without having language for it, was that their undisturbed colonies wintered differently. The hive interiors in spring smelled darker, more resinous, almost sharp, and the clusters that emerged were tighter and more organized than those from colonies that had been worked more heavily. They couldn't have told you why, but the pattern held, and experienced men and women recognized it. Propolis intact hives came through harder winters with less loss. They noted it without fully understanding it, and they respected it. That's the open loop closing now. The quarter-inch measurement tied to its full consequence. A gap under a quarter inch gets sealed. The colony maintains its thermal envelope, keeps its microbial boundary intact, and preserves the acoustic coherence of the brood chamber. A gap above a quarter inch doesn't get fully sealed. The colony's immune architecture begins to fragment at that point. Not all at once, not visibly, but measurably across the winter. The bees haven't failed. The structure has exceeded their biological capacity to compensate. Now to the practical breakdown. The part that matters when you're standing at the hive with a tool in your hand and a decision to make. First, don't scrape propolis from interior hive walls. The frame rests. The small wooden ledges that hold frames in position can be lightly cleared of excess buildup if frames genuinely cannot be lifted, but the wall coating should stay. Second, when you find gaps along hive body joints, measure before you decide. A gap under a quarter inch, the bees will handle. A gap between a quarter and 3/8 inch needs your attention. Use a thin bead of non-toxic wood sealant on the exterior and leave the interior to the bees. A gap above 3/8 inch should be corrected structurally before the colony can address it themselves. Third, seasonal timing matters. Propolis collection peaks between late July and mid-September in most of the eastern United States, when poplar and pine resin flows are strongest. That is the colony's primary building season. Unnecessary inspections during that window carry higher disruption cost than inspections in May or early June. The most common mistake beekeepers make is treating propolis cleanup as hive hygiene. It isn't. Propolis accumulation in appropriate areas is a sign of a healthy, active colony doing exactly what biology designed it to do. The second most common mistake is using entrance reducers with rough-cut edges or irregular gaps, surfaces that beg for propolis work but that the bees can't fully seal because the gap geometry is too irregular. Smooth, consistent entrance edges reduce unnecessary propolis demand and let the colony direct that energy elsewhere. Do not apply this principle during a nosema event or any confirmed disease outbreak. At those moments, interior inspection overrides propolis preservation, and the biological cost of leaving gaps unsealed is secondary to identifying the pathogen. And do not mistake propolis removal for colony intervention during a mite crisis. Propolis management and varroa management are separate problems, even though they interact. Here's the winter connection, and it carries the highest stakes of anything covered in this episode. A colony going into October with a propolis intact interior has a measurable thermal advantage. The resinous lining reduces convective heat loss through the hive walls. The cluster spends less metabolic energy maintaining brood nest temperature in the critical range of 93 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Less energy spent on heating means slower honey consumption through January and February, the months when starvation risk peaks. Colonies in propolis-stripped hive bodies spend more energy on thermal maintenance, consume winter stores faster, and enter early spring in a weaker nutritional state. That's not theory. That's the pattern that Depression-era beekeepers in the hill country were watching, without having the words to explain what they saw. By the mid-1950s, university extension bulletins from land-grant colleges in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia had begun acknowledging propolis as biologically significant rather than merely inconvenient. The 1954 USDA circular on hive management in the southeastern states mentioned, almost as an aside, that colonies in undisturbed wood equipment showed different overwintering profiles than those in frequently cleaned modern gear. The science was catching up, slowly, to what the old-time beekeepers had already learned by watching. And now the highest consequence scenario, the one that applies to every beekeeper keeping bees today. In an era of varroa mite pressure that the 1950s beekeepers never faced, a colony managing varroa is already diverting immune resources. Worker bees with deformed wings reduce the foraging force. Viral loads transmitted by mites suppress overall colony vitality. In a colony where propolis has been repeatedly scraped away and the interior immune envelope is chronically compromised, varroa pressure lands on a colony that is fighting on two fronts simultaneously. The antimicrobial environment that propolis creates inside the hive is not a substitute for mite management. It was never designed to be, but it is a layer of biological resilience that varroa-stressed colonies cannot afford to lose. A colony stripped of its propolis lining and carrying a mite load above the economic threshold is a colony with almost no margin remaining. That margin matters more now than it did in 1882 or 1934 or 1954 because the bees are carrying more today than they ever have before. The bees haven't changed. Their biology is the same now as it was when Appalachian families kept hollow logs along fence rows and called it a good spring if the colony came through. What has changed is how often we open the hive, and how thoroughly we clean it, and how little we have sometimes stopped to ask what the bees were actually building when we weren't looking. Propolis was never the problem. The quarter-inch gap was never the enemy. The colony was never being difficult. They were doing, methodically and quietly, what biology required them to do. Letting them finish that work, and understanding why it matters, is one of the most useful things a beekeeper can learn. That knowledge doesn't come from a catalog. It comes from slowing down, putting the hive tool down for a moment, and watching what the bees do when they think nobody is paying attention. If you've ever left a hive body unscraped and noticed the colony overwintered stronger than your cleaner equipment, share that in the comments. The answer to that question is older than any of us, and it's still worth asking.